Slavery. The very word conjures up images of chains, cruelty, and the worst of humanity. It's a dark stain on human history, and Britain, despite its image as a beacon of freedom, is not exempt from this shameful past. This is the story of how slavery shaped Britain, leaving its mark on the nation's wealth, its culture, and its very soul. We'll journey through time, exploring the lives touched by this brutal system, from the Roman era to the modern day. It's a story of suffering and injustice, but also one of resilience, resistance, and ultimately, the triumph of the human spirit over adversity. Our journey begins not on the shores of Africa, as many might assume, but right here in Britain, centuries before the transatlantic slave trade. It's a history often untold, buried beneath layers of time and conveniently forgotten narratives. We'll unearth this hidden past, revealing how the institution of slavery existed in Britain long before the arrival of African slaves. This is a story that needs to be told, not to shame, but to understand how a nation grappled with its conscience and ultimately chose the path of freedom. Long before the British Empire spanned the globe, the seeds of slavery were already sown on British soil. In Roman Britain, conquered Celtic Britons were forced into servitude, building villas and working the land for their Roman masters. This early form of slavery, while brutal, differed from the race-based chattel slavery that would later define the transatlantic trade. These slaves were seen as possessions, but there was potential for them to earn their freedom and integrate into Roman society. As the Roman Empire crumbled and new powers emerged, slavery continued in different guises. The Anglo-Saxons practiced a form of indentured servitude, where individuals, often impoverished or indebted, were bound to work for a lord in exchange for protection and sustenance. While not identical to chattel slavery, this system still exploited vulnerable people, limiting their freedom and agency. The Norman Conquest in 1066 brought further changes, as William the Conqueror established a feudal system that, while not strictly slavery, tied peasants to the land and their lord's will. These early forms of forced labor laid the groundwork for the acceptance of slavery in British society. While the transatlantic slave trade would later introduce a new level of brutality and racialized oppression, it's crucial to understand that the concept of exploiting human beings for profit was not alien to Britain. These historical roots help to explain how a nation that prided itself on liberty and justice could become deeply entangled in the horrors of the slave trade. The 16th century marked a turning point in British history, ushering in an era of exploration, colonization, and tragically, the transatlantic slave trade. Driven by the insatiable demand for labor on sugar plantations in the Americas, European powers, including Britain, turned to Africa as a source of cheap, exploitable manpower. This marked the beginning of one of the darkest chapters in human history, a period of unimaginable cruelty and suffering that would shape the destinies of millions. British involvement in the slave trade began with merchants like John Hawkins, who made fortunes transporting enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies. The trade soon became a cornerstone of the British economy, with cities like Liverpool, Bristol, and Glasgow profiting immensely from the trafficking of human beings. Ships built in British shipyards, financed by British banks, and manned by British sailors, set sail for the west coast of Africa, where they traded manufactured goods for captured Africans. These voyages, known as the Middle Passage, were journeys of unimaginable horror, crammed into the suffocating holds of ships, chained together with barely enough space to move. Millions of Africans perished from disease, starvation, or despair. Those who survived the harrowing journey faced a life of brutal labor on plantations, stripped of their humanity and subjected to unimaginable cruelty. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't just about economics, it was also underpinned by a deeply racist ideology. Europeans justified their actions by viewing Africans as inferior, as less than human, and therefore deserving of their fate. This toxic combination of greed and prejudice fueled the slave trade for centuries, leaving an indelible stain on both sides of the Atlantic. The Caribbean islands, bathed in sunshine and fringed by turquoise waters, became synonymous with unimaginable cruelty. Sugar, the white gold that fueled the British economy, came at a terrible human cost. On vast plantations, enslaved Africans toiled under the relentless Caribbean sun, their lives ruled by the whip and the whims of their masters. Life on a plantation was a living hell. Enslaved Africans were treated as mere chattel, denied even the most basic human rights. Families were torn apart, their languages and cultures suppressed. Punishments were brutal and often inflicted for the slightest transgression. The overseers, driven by profit and a sense of racial superiority, ruled with an iron fist, their cruelty knowing no bounds. The average lifespan of an enslaved African on a sugar plantation was shockingly short. Many succumbed to diseases like yellow fever and malaria, their bodies weakened by overwork and malnutrition. Others died from the brutal treatment inflicted upon them, their spirits broken by the relentless cycle of toil and abuse. The sugar that sweetened the teacups of Britain's elite was stained with the blood and sweat of generations of enslaved Africans. Yet, even in the face of such dehumanizing conditions, the enslaved Africans never gave up hope. They found solace in their shared heritage, their music, their stories, and their faith. Acts of resistance, both large and small, were a constant feature of plantation life. From slowing down work to sabotaging equipment, from running away to forming clandestine communities, the enslaved Africans refused to be broken. Their resilience in the face of such adversity is a testament to the indomitable human spirit. As the 18th century progressed, a sense of unease about the morality of slavery began to stir within British society. Enlightenment ideals, emphasizing reason and individual liberty, prompted some to question the ethics of profiting from the suffering of others. Religious groups, particularly Quakers, condemned slavery as a sin, a violation of God's law. These early voices of dissent, though seemingly insignificant at the time, planted the seeds for a movement that would eventually sweep across the nation. One of the most powerful voices against slavery belonged to Olaudah Equiano, a formerly enslaved African who purchased his freedom and became a prominent abolitionist. His autobiography, detailing the horrors of the Middle Passage and his experiences as a slave, shocked British society. Equiano's eloquent writing and first-hand accounts of the brutality of slavery challenged the deeply ingrained prejudices of the time and helped to galvanize the abolitionist movement. Another key figure in the early abolitionist movement was Granville Sharp, a passionate advocate for the rights of enslaved Africans. Sharp dedicated his life to fighting for the freedom of enslaved people in Britain, taking on numerous legal cases and challenging the very foundation of slavery within the British legal system. These early abolitionists faced an uphill battle. They were opposed by powerful vested interests, including wealthy plantation owners and merchants who profited immensely from the slave trade. However, their unwavering commitment to justice and equality gradually began to sway public opinion. The tide was slowly turning, the seeds of abolition had been sown, and a powerful movement for change was beginning to take root. The fight for abolition gained significant momentum in the late 18th century, fueled by a growing sense of moral outrage and a series of strategic campaigns. Abolitionists, now a diverse group of individuals from different backgrounds and walks of life, employed various tactics to raise awareness and pressure the government to act. One of the most effective tools used by abolitionists was the power of the printed word. Pamphlets, books, and newspapers spread the message of abolition far and wide, exposing the horrors of the slave trade to a wider audience. Images of slave ships, depicting the inhumane conditions endured by captured Africans, shocked and outraged the British public. Public meetings and lectures became increasingly common, with prominent abolitionists like William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, and Elizabeth Hayrick captivating audiences with their passionate speeches. These events played a crucial role in mobilizing public support for abolition, transforming the issue from a fringe concern to a national debate. The abolitionists also recognized the importance of political action. They lobbied members of parliament, presented petitions signed by thousands of ordinary citizens, and organized boycotts of sugar and other goods produced by enslaved labor. This multi-pronged approach, combining public awareness campaigns with political pressure, proved highly effective in shifting public opinion and forcing the government to confront the issue of slavery. The fight for abolition was long and arduous, marked by setbacks and disappointments. However, the movement's unwavering commitment to justice and equality slowly began to erode the foundations of the slave trade. The tide was turning, and the British government could no longer ignore the growing clamor for change.